Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth webinar, which is part of the webinar series on special and inclusive education that the Department of Education of the University of Nicosia is organizing this academic year. Series with distinguished world-leading researchers as our guest speakers. I'm Kyriakos Dimitriou, an assistant professor in special and inclusive education at the University of Nicosia here in Cyprus. I will be the moderator of today's session. It is a real great pleasure, and I'm honored to welcome our guest speaker for today's webinar, Professor Michael Wehmeyer, who is one of the pioneers in the field of special and inclusive education. Professor Wehmeyer's name probably comes first to our minds when we refer to notions like self-determination, inclusion of people with severe disabilities, positive psychology, among many other notions. So we're really fortunate to have Professor Wehmeyer joining us today as one of the world's leading researchers in the field, and to hear his speak on a very exciting topic. The title of his talk is Inclusive Education in a Strengths-Based Era, Mapping the Future of the Field. Professor Michael Wehmeyer, we are delighted to have you joining us, and we are very delighted to have an exciting presentation coming up from you.
I thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity, and to you and the University of Nicosia to have the chance to share some thoughts with everyone this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're most welcome. I have the great pleasure of introducing you. So I would like to read a short summary of your very rich and impressive bio to our audience.
Keep it short.
With some important information about yourself and your work. So Professor Michael Lee Wehmeyer is the Ross and Mariana Beach Distinguished Professor of Special Education, Chair of the Department of Special Education, and Director and Senior Scientist, Beach Center on Disability, all at the University of Kansas in the United States of America. His research and scholarly work has focused issues pertaining to self-determination, positive psychology and disability, transition to adulthood, the education and inclusion of students with severe disabilities, conceptualizing intellectual disability, and technology use by people with cognitive disabilities. He has published more than 470 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. He is an author or editor of 45 texts. He is past president and a fellow of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, a fellow of the American Psychological Association Division 33, Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Division. He has been recognized for his research and service with Lifetime Achievement Awards from numerous associations and organizations, including the American Psychological Association, American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, the Council for Exceptional Children, and the ARC of the United States. So that was a brief introduction to Professor Michael Wehmeyer. I'm sure that the audience is already impressed. And now I guess if you want to share your slides, I'm happy to hand over the floor to you for your presentation. While you are doing this, before we start, before I forget, I just wanted to briefly mention that this webinar and all webinars in our series are live streamed, and then they become available on the YouTube channel of the university, the Facebook page, and the university's website. So the audience will be able to watch them asynchronously later, anytime they desire. And the last thing, I would like to invite our audience to write their comments or questions in the Q&A. Actually, I'm talking about the chat either on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you are watching us from. So Professor Wehmeyer can address them after his presentation. So over to you, Professor Wehmeyer. We are really excited to have you. Thank you once again for joining us. And we're interested in hearing your talk. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you, Professor Dimitriou. I presume that my slides can be seen, and I will be told if that's not the case. So it really is nice to have this chance. Wish I could be there in person, but that's the world we're in today. So there's some advantages, obviously, to being able to do these kinds of things virtually. It can reach a larger audience. I don't know if I would lay claim to the adjective of a pioneer, although I certainly had the opportunity to get in at the very beginning of an important movement around issues of self-determination that I'll talk about in just a second. But pioneer implies that you've been around a while. And as I sort of head toward the last few years of my career, I've been particularly focused on the future of the field and what we need to do as a field to prepare for that future and to be in that future. And it involves and combines a number of areas in which I've worked. And over the next 45 or so minutes, I just want to touch on some of the highlights and the big points around where I think we need to go in inclusive education, in strengths-based approaches as we head into the future. So I think it all begins with how we think about disability. And for most of the history of disability, which I've authored a couple of books that looked at the history of disability and particularly the history of intellectual disability in the U.S. Particularly, but there are parallels throughout the world. Beginning in the mid 19th century, ideas and conceptualizations of disability emerged within, logically, the medical field. Most of the early pioneers in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities and disability were medical professionals. And so disability was conceptualized as an extension of the medical model, which looked at health as something one had, an interiorized state. And then health problems became individual pathologies, a problem within the person. And so disability was seen as disorder, as pathology, and a problem within the person, and to a large degree, a problem with the person. And, when we conceptualize disability in that way, it's inevitable, really, that we begin to see people with disability as broken or diseased or pathological or atypical or aberrant, whatever you want to term you want to use, and all of those have been used in various fields. And when we think about people in this way, unavoidably, really, people are seen as associated with negative stereotypes, as problems within society. The advent of intelligence testing sort of created a pseudoscientific way to think about these kinds of things. And so, but in the late 20th century, the medical field itself began to recognize that thinking about disability in these ways, thinking about disability and other chronic, longer-term health-related issues was not productive. And so a couple of taxonomies, ways of thinking about disability, ways of classifying disability emerged. I'm sure that many in the audience are well acquainted with the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, the ICIDH, which was released by the World Health Organization in 1980. And in 2001, then the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. And what those two classification systems did was they removed disability from an individual pathology and situated disability as part and parcel of the context, along with what a person can do and the impacts of the health-related issues. In 2012, I was the editor for the Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology and Disability. And really, even 10 years earlier than that, 2002, even though the ICF was released in 2001, we didn't really have a language to talk about disability in a strengths-based way, and a notion of positive psychology of disability was fairly limited. And 10 years later, there was a growing and emerging field of positive psychology and disability. Here's my simple classification of what the ICF and what we call social ecological, biopsychosocial models of disability have us consider in terms of understanding disability. For the vast majority of time, and frankly still today here in the US and around the world, disability was, as I said, understood in aspects of personal incompetence and a problem within the person. And we developed an entire field, if you will, of assessing personal incompetence to classify, to categorize, and to diagnose and to place. But what the ICF particularly does, and what the ICIDH initially began to do, was to step outside of this idea that disability resides within the person. The ICF asks us to take a look at what is it that people do well. What are they good at? What are their strengths? And certainly to also look at health-related limitations, but and the context of the environment. What is it that people want to do, and where is it they want to do these things? So disability, as you saw there, resides only in the gap, if you will, between personal competence, what the person can do, what the person wants to do, and the environment. And as we close that gap through supports, through education, through modifications to environments, disability itself doesn't go away, obviously, but it becomes less relevant to the conversation. Now, I do want to acknowledge and point out that in the current disability activism and advocacy, there is a growing disability identity where people embrace their disability and are not concerned about or are interested in having that aspect of themselves acknowledged. Social models of disability place the onus on the environment, on policies, on society to not only accommodate for, but to accept the fact that disability is part of the rich diversity of human life. And I recognize and of course support that. And so these I think these biopsychosocial or social ecological or person environment fit models, they're helpful for those of us who work in the realm of trying to design, if you will, interventions and supports that enable people to be successful within the context of their lives and to live rich, full lives in society. So what are some of the implications for us of these changing understandings of disability? First of all, they're strengths-based. We begin by talking about what people can do, not what people can't do, which has been the model for far too long. We talk, every human being has strengths, has abilities, has interests, has passions, and can act volitionally. And so these models and sort of strengths-based approaches require that we begin with what people can and want to do. Secondly, these understandings of disability emphasize that disability is part of and not apart from typical human functioning. Disability is just a part of human functioning. And I think that the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities really emphasizes that, talks about the right to inherent dignity, the idea that all people are worthy and valued by their status as a person. And so understanding disabilities within social models, within social ecological models, helps us to move away from ideas that somehow people are not with disabilities are not quite like the rest of us. That's been the historical norm. Disability and people with disabilities, just part of typical human functioning. For those that work in the realm of intervention, in special education, certainly there's a focus on the environment and the context, not on fixing or changing the person. That doesn't mean that we, obviously, our role as educators is to teach students and enable students to gain skills and knowledge and abilities that enable them to function. That's what we do. That's our role in the lives of children and young people. So but we're not focused on fixing the person because they're disabled. We're focused on enabling and promoting functioning, and much of what we have to do is a focus on the environment and the context. How do those change? What can we do to enable people to function successfully? And there's an emphasis on sports and not programs. I took out a number of slides on this just because of time constraints, but I want to really emphasize my colleague Jim Thompson at the University of Kansas has been a leader, and I've had the privilege of being involved in efforts that look at and conceptualize a supports paradigm for disability. That is, historically, what we did was we diagnosed students with a particular type and level of disability and level of impairment, and we created programs, often segregated in separate programs that were supposedly intended to provide very specialized instruction, materials, methods. But I think it's pretty evident that hasn't worked very well. What we need to do, and it's along the line of personalized learning and personalized supports that I'll talk more about, is we need to take a look at every child has strengths. My colleague Young Zhao talks about jagged profiles. Students are good at some things and not as good at other things, and that profile is different for every child. We need to begin to identify supports that enable a child to function successfully based upon that child's profile, and not based upon some overly generic label that suggests that if you have this label, then you get this curriculum, which is, again, often too there's an increased emphasis on electronic and information technology. It was mentioned that some of my work has been in this area of impairment, or I'm sorry, in technology, cognitive technology, particularly. Sorry, technology is providing supports that I think we're heading into an era where it won't matter what you can't do. It won't matter what you cannot do. What will matter is the supports that you have to do what you want to do. And many of those supports are going to be in the form of electronic and information technology, whether those are learning supports or functioning. We can just come up with so many examples of how technology is enabling all of us to be more successful in context. If I were in Cyprus, I would undoubtedly need to use my Google Maps app, my Google Translate app. I would need to have technology to support me to be successful. So I'm not going to go into that a whole lot more, but it's a part of where we need to move. Personalized learning. I'll come back to this in momentarily, but we need to look at, as I said, what supports does each child need, and then there is a focus in these sort of 21st century models of education on self-determination, on student autonomy, on student interests and preferences. So many examples. We as human beings pay attention to what we like and what we care about, what we're passionate about. Children and young people who are educated, that incorporates their curiosity, their passion, their interests, learn. That's, I think it's a universal truth. These strengths-based approaches then to understanding have direct impact on what we as special educators ought to be doing. And I think we ought to be looking at this for all learners. I published a book a couple of years ago strengths-based approaches to educating all learners with disabilities. I wanted to drop the with disabilities because I think it's all children. But the point here is that what is good for children with disability is good for all children. And what's good for all children is good for children with disability. We need to move away from notions. We need to go beyond special education and just look at high quality education for all learners. And the good news is we have a number of things that already incorporate these person environment or social ecological person environment fit models of disability. Universal design for learning, universal design for learning modifies something about the learning context, right? We focus mainly on technology and on providing technology-based learning tools in which we can, if you can't read well, we can provide digital talking books that read text to speech and that help you both learn to read better and allow you to participate in reading when the rest of the class is. But universal design for learning is really about designing curriculum, about designing environments for all children to be successful. I've already talked a little bit about technology supports. Obviously, there are some children that need specific assistive technologies and accommodations. I think what those look like are changing and will, I think more and more incorporated into everyday off-the-shelf kinds of technology. But nevertheless, speech and language, AAC kinds of things, obviously mobility devices, even those are changing though. In the UK last year or a couple of years ago, there was a firm that started manufacturing wheelchairs for people who had ordered them using 3D printing, and it cut the cost in half, and it's still customizable to the person. And then, as I've mentioned, electronic and information technology is going to be critically important in personalizable education for all children. The school-wide applications. I think my colleague at KU, Wayne Saylor, a couple of decades ago pointed out that, when we focus only on the classroom in terms of inclusion, we miss the whole context, and that 21st century learning and strengths-based learning looks at school-wide applications in which all children are involved. You're going to hear from my colleague, Kathleen Lane, who does school-wide work in a couple of webinars, I think, away. But, positive behavior interventions and supports, multi-tiered systems of supports, those all, the key of multi-tiered system supports is if a student isn't succeeding, what changes is the instruction, the curriculum, the intensity, something about that, and not the child. We don't yank the child out if they're not doing well. We change and we modify what we're doing so that students can learn. Personalizable education, I'll talk a little bit about self-determined learning. My colleague Young Zhao and I did a book a little bit ago talking about these notions of needing to personalize, and a decade ago, it really wasn't feasible to do this. But I think the technology has caught up, and now it is possible to really personalize learning and create personalizable education. There's a focus on self-determination, self-determined learning, and active student involvement. I think specifically for inclusive education, my colleague Jennifer Kurth and I did a book here recently looking at sort of the topics we're talking about today. In fact, that's where I drew the title for this talk from. But I think we're moving into a new generation of inclusive practices. The first generation of inclusion, if you will, was that children were moved from outside the general education classroom into general education. And so physically locating within the neighborhood school, within the classes in which their same age peers went to. Once we began to make progress, we needed interventions to teach these children in general education classrooms. So the second generation was a focus on these interventions, like differentiated instruction, like co-teaching, that enable us to educate children with disabilities in that context. And then the third generation came along as people begin to challenge the rigor, if you will, of the education of many children with disabilities. So, we talked about access to the general education curriculum. So it was a focus on not just where we taught students, which is important, but a focus on what we teach and how we teach. Again, these notions of personalized learning come into play there. Nothing about these three generations of practice are obsolete. We're still working in the United States to move children from more segregated, self-contained settings into the general education classroom. We've made progress, but it's very slow. And I've been around the world enough to know that that's true across the globe. So nothing about these. We still need interventions. We still need validation. We still need to focus on that. But I think we are heading, with all of this and with those three things as a presumption of the education of all children, to a fourth generation where there's an emphasis on providing individualized, personalized supports in typical settings, recognizing the jagged profile of every child and creating personalizable education that enables all child to be successful. These are, of course, school-wide instead of just classroom focus, and then there's a focus on student agency and self-determined learning, and that, of course, has been much of the focus of my work. Although I've worked in each of these areas at some point in time, but I want to kind of wrap up in the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about these issues of self-determination. In 1990, when I started working on issues of self-determination, there was literally one article in the special education literature that talked about self-determination, drawing at that time from self-determination theory, the work of Ed Deasy and Rich Ryan, and we sort of had to create a system. There was a broad understanding that young people needed to be self-determined. The question was, how do we enable young people with disabilities to be self-determined? And you begin by understanding what this is. So, the notion of self-determination comes from the philosophical doctrine of determinism back into the late 16th century that posits that events or natural laws that precede or are antecedent to the occurrence of action. It just suggests that all behavior is caused, right? Determinism suggests that all action or behavior is caused, and self-determinism or self-determination implies that people or individuals cause themselves to act in certain ways, as opposed to someone else or something else causing them. So it's about people causing or making things to happen in their own lives. Now, importantly, within the disability rights movement and the disability identity movement and the advocacy movement, the notions of self-determination have been imbued with the empowerment and rights orientation typically associated with the sense of self-determination as a national or political construct. So we talk about the rights of nations to self-determination, to self-governance. And, even at a personal level, I think self-governance is a decent way to think about this. But empowerment is associated with social movements and references to actions that enhance people to control their lives. So within the disability advocacy and rights movement, self-determination really is viewed both within the idea that people have the right to self-govern their own lives and that they want to make or cause things to happen in their own life. And of course, in education, our role is to promote the knowledge, skills, abilities, and create opportunities that enable young people to make or cause things to happen in their own life. I don't really talk about it. I think it's important to just mention it's not about doing everything yourself. It's about making things happen in your own life. And that often means leveraging or utilizing something else or someone else to help you to do what you want to do. I created a functional model of self-determination in the early 90s as we began to try to understand the construct to be able to apply it to education. We've gone through and sort of reconceptualized the functional model into causal agency theory. Basically, causal agency theory attempts to explain how people become self-determined. And, we talk about self-determination within the model, and really I have across the last 30 years, it's a dispositional characteristic manifested as acting as the causal agent in one's life. Self-determined people, that is people who are causal agents, act in service to freely chosen goals, and self-determined actions function to enable a person to be the causal agent in his or her life. My colleagues, Carrie Sjogren and others, have worked very closely with us on this and have led now a lot of the intervention work we do. A dispositional characteristic is just, a tendency to act in certain ways. So self-determined people, tend to act in certain ways that enable them to act as causal agents. And a causal agent is just someone who makes or causes things to happen in their life. I mean, we try to distinguish between just causing something to people are acting to cause something that enables them to accomplish something or to create or cause change. They're acting to create a better quality of life, actually, if you look at it at a broad sense. So causal action and causal agency refers to actions that enable people to improve their circumstances, to do what they want and desire to do in order to create a better life. And one of the reasons we created causal agency theory was to align our work more with self-determination theory and to create a theory of the development of self-determination. And I'm not going to go into there's plenty of you can get access to this, but we look at three essential characteristics of self-determined action: volitional action, that is acting autonomously, self-initiation; agentic action, which is really the skills and abilities that enable you to take what you wanted to do with volitional action and make it happen. And then action control beliefs that enable you to believe that you and act accordingly to seek goals. I've talked about school-wide efforts. There's lots of ways that within schools, looking at causal agency theory on the component element side, schools can be promoting and providing opportunities to make choices for later in adolescence, working on decision-making skills throughout time. But, varying according to a child's developmental age or developmental and abilities, goal setting and attainment, planning, problem solving, self-regulation and self-management, self-advocacy skills, self-awareness, and self-knowledge. All of these are elements that enable young people to become self-determined, to become causal agents in their lives. These begin very early on. There are developmental courses to all children understanding these things. So again, this is not a disability-specific way of thinking about disability. It is a theory or a framework that enables us to look at how to enable all children to become more self-determined. Of course, instruction is one thing. We also have to provide opportunities for young people and children to act as causal agents in their lives, to make choices, to be involved in decisions, to set their own goals. If we're not providing opportunities, if we're only teaching, then children will not be as successful as we desire. And then, of course, supports. Children will need supports, and young people will need supports that enable them to be successful. We've been doing this work quite a long time. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of working with colleague Yang Zhao. Yang has worked in entrepreneurial and creativity in children, and he is a leading voice around the world in sort of global 21st century education. And we talked about kind of taking the next step. Even there's, we need to move beyond where we are now around focusing on self-determined action, and we need to really focus on self-determined learning. In self-determined learning, teachers teach students to teach themselves, and I'm going to show you how we've done that in our work. Students learn how to set and achieve goals and to make plans. Teachers relinquish ownership for learning to the student by creating learning communities and using teaching methods that emphasize student curiosity and experiences, by creating learning communities that are autonomy supportive, and by ensuring that learning is tied to activities that are intrinsically motivating or lead to the attainments of goals that are valued and based upon student preferences, interest, and value. Passion, creating autonomy supports, leveraging what children care and are motivated to do, and turning learning over to the student. Teachers provide competence supports. This is from a self-determination theory, by emphasizing mastery experiences, using assessments that are both teacher and student directed to provide supportive feedback, and then to change instruction to align with students' strengths and abilities. Again, these notions in MTSS focus on all of those. Relationships and relatedness are critical in self-determined learning. And in fact, I think probably the central aspect of all, good teaching is about creating relationship with students. So, and when you provide choice opportunities, when you provide when you support student volition and you emphasize the goal process for every student, it strengthens. There's pretty good evidence that children who care about their teacher do better. It's pretty straightforward. Students take initiative in learning because learning is meaningful and of personal value to them. And finally, students act volitionally because they are provided choices that are meaningfully different and autonomy supportive. I think, we talk about this in the context of all children, if this is how education is approached for all children, then students with disabilities will be successful. We have created and evaluated interventions, and that intervention work is ongoing by a large team led by Drs. Carrie Sjogren, Shada Rayleigh, and others. focused on an intervention we developed in the mid-90s, the self-determined learning model of instruction. It's a teaching model that enables teachers to teach students to teach themselves. Students are supported to learn to self-regulate problem solving, to set goals, to create an action plan, to achieve the goal, to track their progress toward their goal, and to adjust their action plan or goal as needed based upon their progress. We have strong evidence with students with disabilities. We are working to create a strong and evidence base with students without disabilities, because this is a model that enables all children and young people. We've developed assessment, the self-determination inventory system. There are multiple online versions of this that measure those essential characteristics: volitional action, causal action, and action control beliefs. You can see all of this and more at the, if you just go to self-determination.org. That'll get you to the website. I mentioned the self-determined learning model of instruction. I recognize that this is a very busy slide, but the key here is that students solve a problem. In phase one, the problem is what is my goal, right? And so they answer a series of 4 questions that enable them to identify their priorities, to identify what they already know, to identify what they need to know, and at the end, to set a goal related to their learning needs. That setting a goal takes you to phase 2, which is how do I achieve my goal? Again, 4 problems, students self-regulate problem solving that enables them to create an action plan, and at the end to create a self-monitoring process. That then takes them to the action phase. They implement their action plan. They answer 4 questions that enables them to evaluate where they are. If students are not making progress on their goal, the first thing they do eventually is go back to phase 2. Your action plan probably needs beefing up and improving. If you've changed your action plan several times and you find that you're not making progress on the goal is your problem. So you go back to phase 1 and you refine your goal so that you're able to then set another action plan and move it. And it's an iterative process. So every student can be successful and achieve a goal, even if it's not the goal that they set initially. We've implemented the self-determined learning model of instruction with young children with more extensive support needs, students across disability categories, students without disabilities, and it's all a matter of how much support they need. We have very strong evidence of the efficacy of this. We did a longitudinal randomized trial study that showed that students became more self-determined if they were involved in interventions to promote self-determination. 1 year after school, they had self-determination score significantly predicted greater community access and greater employment, more positive employment. And then 2 years post-intervention, continued to predict community access. What we found was that by year 2, what predicts employment outcomes are student having a job in year 1. So there is a teacher's guide that is associated with the self-determined learning model of instruction that you can download. There's resources on the website that enables you to do that. One of the what I will emphasize is that the self-determined learning model of instruction does keep the student in the center of the process. Students are involved in self-regulated problem solving. It doesn't matter whether they do that independently. Remember, self-determination is not about doing things yourself. It's about making or causing things to happen. So with supports, whatever support's needed, students go through this self-regulated process, and you'll be surprised and how much that changes, by focusing on what students are interested in, what they value. It changes student achievement as well as student interest in what they're learning. I mentioned the self-determination inventory system. Again, if you go to the selfdetermination.org, you will find resources related to that as well. There's a student report and a parent-teacher report version of that. And with that, I have ended my presentation, and I'm going to turn it back over to whomever I'm turning it back over to.
A very comprehensive presentation. I repeat what I said earlier before your presentation, that we are lucky to have you, fortunate to have you today as our guest speaker. We are really glad to learn from your experience and the research-based knowledge that you shared with us. So we do appreciate that you shared with us all those beautiful examples, information and examples that I'm sure that our audience will find very helpful and useful, of course.
Thank you. I do want to apologize. I must have somehow set a timer to change my PowerPoint slides every so often, so it would flip to the next slide without me wanting it to go there. So that's why I kept going back and forth. I'll have to go back and make sure that
that wasn't the problem at all. Believe me, we were very focused on what you were sharing with us, so that wasn't the problem at all. As I said, I'm sure that the audience actually will appreciate what you shared with us and found very helpful and useful the information. I'm looking at the comments that we received from the audience. Actually, we haven't got any question yet. We got some comments though, people who are congratulating you, of course. Many people say hello, and they agree that this is a great presentation. We have a person from Greece, if you recognize the name, who says that you are a pioneer and a self-determination pioneer, actually, and a mentor for me, providing me using first time in Greece the ARC self-determination scale for my doctoral thesis.
Well, and I'm flattered and appreciate the compliment, but to be honest, the greatest satisfaction is that young people and folks who have the rest of their career to go have embraced these ideas and will take it to the next level. And because there was a point in time early in my career where it was not certain that these issues of self-determination would remain on front and center, but it's because of people like the person who made the comment. That's the future of self-determination, and I'm grateful that, and I will say these issues of self-determination have universal application, and I think the fact there is a Greek version of the ARC self-determination scale, there's a Chinese Mandarin version, there's versions of it, and that's because these ideas of enabling people to be causal agent in their lives, I think it goes to the notion in the CRPD about inherent dignity and the right to autonomy and to make choices in one life. That is universal, and that's not something that's Western or Eastern or whatever. And so all over the world, there are people who are implementing and creating what works in their context. So I just want to encourage. There's so much work yet to be done, not only in the United States but all over the world in really enabling. And I think one of the messages I hope that I delivered was, I think that we're in and heading toward an era in which these ideas of self-determination, self-determined learning, all become critical to the success of all young people and children. I think one of the lessons we got in the U.S. from the COVID pandemic in the early months when everything was shut down and students were learning at home is far too many children were not successful at autonomously self-determined learning. Schools can be dependency creating circumstances. We do things to and for students, and we need to enable students to do things for themselves. And I think that taught us a lesson that we need to focus on this. And those ideas are entirely consistent with and part of ideas in personalized learning and personalizable education, where children are supported. So anyway.
I totally agree with what you said, that self-determination is something universal and not something that applies only or refers only to the Western lifestyle, especially now, because actually we give emphasis on the rights that children have. And I think self-determination is a basic human right for everyone. But especially for people with disability, for children with disabilities, because many times the environment that we create around those children is not very enabling. So they cannot become agents, as you said, causal agents or independent. Because you referred to the pandemic, I wanted to ask something. I have a question about self-determination and during the pandemic for children with disabilities. In Cyprus, I know that this happened also in other countries, I don't know in the US. This fundamental right was violated, this of self-determination, when we had the lockdowns, when the government decided to close down the schools and convert to online learning. Because most of the children with disabilities here saw themselves being excluded from online and distance learning due to insufficient preparation. The teachers were not prepared how to use actually to utilize the technology and the platform that they were given to include children with disabilities. So it seems that political decisions were were made without taking into account the voices of children with disabilities, nor their parents' voices. So what is your experience on this in the case of the United States during the lockdowns or after the lockdowns? Because even when they reopened the schools here, again, the children with disabilities were excluded because there was no any protocol to ensure their safety. So they excluded them once again. So what happened in the US, and what is your viewpoint on this?
I don't think it's very different from what you described, and I suspect that's true all over. School personnel were in an unwinnable situation, but even going into today, and what I see now with the disability rights and disability advocates talking about political decisions around masks or not to mask it, that the rights of people with disability have been marginalized. And I think the same thing happened in schools. I think you made a couple of points. I think there's some lessons out of all of this beyond the politics, which which of course politics are politics. One is, I mentioned that I thought the pandemic illustrated that we had few that students weren't ready to self-determined learning. I think it also illustrated that in many cases schools and teachers were not ready to promote sort of autonomous self-determined learning. So, I think we saw both things happen, and I think there is a what I think the pandemic did in terms of moving us down the road toward more personalized learning. We've been talking about personalized learning for a long time. We've been talking about 21st century skills. In fact, editors will no longer let me use the term 21st century skills because we're 22 years into it, right? But we're not where we wanted to be when we started talking about 21st century skills. And what the pandemic did was it forced education systems to implement technology that otherwise would not have been implemented. It forced teachers to become familiar with technology that they might not otherwise use, and it forced children to a large degree to be to utilize this. I think it also, unfortunately, and we've all had Zoom fatigue and all of these things. There's a sort of people are tired of the technology and want to get back to, the way things were. But we won't go back to the way things were because now we have a sense of how to do these things. But, I think so there's that aspect. I think we have to leverage the fact that it moved us forward for good or ill, and these are tools that we can use. But and I think it also, back to your main point, it's an illustration that children with disability, young people with disability, adults with disability in our societies, we have a long way to go to reach the purpose of the CRPD, and to genuinely have people with disability be meaningful parts of our society where decisions are made with people with disability in mind as well as the rest of society. So again, maybe that point, maybe the experience of the pandemic will have made the point in ways that we couldn't have otherwise understood.
Yeah, thank you for answering. Yes, I agree that now we are more prepared probably to face any similar situations in the future. But coronavirus is impacting our lives, still impacting.
Yeah.
And in the case of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the impact is even higher because, yes, in most countries, they are highly vulnerable, as you said, to stigma, to discrimination, to segregation. Also, we can see that even if we have in place the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child or of the person with disabilities, those people and children do not avail themselves of the rights that they have. So we are doing great in theory, but not in practice, actually.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. And the fact is that in the public in the United States, and I think all over the world, that the old way of thinking about disability is still the way people think about it. They think about disability as being pathology, as being deficit. Again, there's and I think the future is that people with disability, disabled people themselves, are becoming voices in society to point out that they are, they have rights to full participation and citizenship.
Yeah, I think the situation is similar here. Here is even worse, I could say, because Here we have a blended approach to disability. We still have this charity approach to disability. People believe that we should raise money because those people are in need and they are dependent on or us powerful. And the other approach is the human rights, which is, of course, a positive move. Um, um, but we still have the charity approach of disability.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, I have another question now, because you said um, you discussed in your presentation earlier about the different systems to taxonomize disability, the different labels, and because labeling is one of my research interests. Um, you referred to the new approach, actually, which is about strengths-based models of disability. This new approach, of course, requires a change in terms of the way we understand disability. Uh, so my question about the labels, it's about the labels that we still use in education. Most of them have their origins from the old-fashioned medical model of disability. At least in the Greek language, we still have some very old-fashioned. For example, we still use most people use the exact translation of mental retardation instead of intellectual disability yeah. So one could claim that some of the current expectation and negative views towards disability are maintained mainly due to that practice to label people using those old-fashioned labels.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember something that Braham Norwich said from the University of Exeter, and Anna Lewis, that those categories and labels that we still use are not very useful for us as educators, because they still probably stigmatize. So what is your point of view on this in relation with self-determination? How do these labels themselves and the process of labeling affect the right that children have to self-determine themselves?
Yeah, I think it's a really critical point in terms of how, as we move forward. And I didn't really spend a lot of time on it. I mentioned the supports paradigm, and I think the ultimate outcome, in my opinion, of a supports paradigm is we move to a system where children receive the supports they need to be successful in learning and in life, independent of a label. The labels are not very helpful, and they are stigmatizing. Within education, personalized learning, personalizable education, supports paradigm, look at all children as, again, having a jagged profile of being able to have abilities in areas, having limitations and learning needs and support needs in other areas. There's a lot of children in American schools who are not successful, but who are not eligible for special education because they don't have a label or a diagnosis. Those children can benefit from interventions that like we talked about, UDL and multi-tiered systems and all of those things. I personally think that we have the capacity right now to just abandon the idea of having to have a label, and we can move to systems where all children get the support that they need, and we can move away from these educational models that or systems where, in order to get supports that you need, in order to get educational supports, you have to have a label and a diagnosis. It's going to be hard. Certainly within the U.S., there's federal laws. There's always a tension between only so much money, and certain people should get more of that money than others. But again, I think the route out of this is that all children in a personalizable education model can benefit from supports, and it doesn't require a separate segregated system. I also saw, not to shift gears too quickly, I saw a question about somebody wanting to know what PE teachers, physical
Yeah, I
education
was
teachers.
going to ask you that question. Yes, thank you.
I was just going to say that there is actually, within the self-determination theory research and motivation, there's quite a lot of work on physical education. Um, your work on friendship and play is critical to to enabling young people to become self-determined. It's about relationships, and it's about participation and friendship and play and physical education. Those are all critical domains that don't get nearly enough attention. And yet maybe the most important things we could focus on. I've worked with a colleague out of Korea who has worked with John Marshall Reeve, Hyun Sun Cheon, Cheon, and John Marshall Reeve. They developed an intervention called autonomy supportive intervention. I can't remember what it's ASIP, ASIP, and it's a model to train coaches how to provide autonomy supports rather than sort of the typical models of motivation, which tend to rely on punishment and yelling and things like that. But it's been used with teachers to provide autonomy support. So I think the key for all of us is we need to learn how to create autonomy supportive environments and contexts in which all children can be successful. So I think there's as much application to a lot of this, and I do tend to focus in my presentations on what we think about in terms of academic learning, and because many children with disability have been excluded from academic learning. I often talk about we want to teach functional or life skills. What's more functional than learning to read, right? I mean, there are few skills in life that are more functional, that are more important to life success than reading. And so the emphasis is not to exclude children from literacy instruction, but that also, I think we need to have a broader focus on, for all children, on relationships. I mean, we know that in 21st century skills, communication, social relationships are critical and will be critical for children in the coming years. So
I really like the way you answered the question about the labels, and then you moved to the question which is about which was about how the PE teachers can implement education, how to promote actually self-advocacy and self-determination, which is a very important skill. I came across a study that I don't remember who conducted that study, which was about how to promote spontaneous communication to people who actually are not verbal. And so we have severe cases of autism, I think, was the subject. Because what the researchers noticed was that the problem was with the educational system, that teachers actually promote what we call prompt communication. We stand in front of them and we pose some questions and we make decisions on their behalf. And the key here is to promote this skill to initiate this spontaneous communication. And this is very similar to what you said earlier about how we can create that enabling environment to promote this autonomy and for them to become autonomous.
That's a great illustration, and it reminds me of how things have changed. In the 1970s, work by Ziegler and others talked about outer directiveness, and they talked about people with intellectual disability as having the characteristic of being outer directed. And that meant that they were waiting on somebody to prompt them, that they would not do things spontaneously, they would not self-initiate. What that really is an indictment of, in the 70s, we were, and into the 80s, we were characterizing that as a characteristic of the people, that was a characteristic of people with intellectual disability. What it really was an indictment of the systems that created dependency and didn't enable people to become autonomous and self-determined. And I think it's an illustration. We've moved now in 40 and 50 years we should have moved from understanding that as a problem with the person being outer directed to a problem within the system that we need to change, that it relates to prompt dependency, and we don't fade prompts. We're not very good at that in the systems. And I think it also illustrates, these issues of self-determination are applicable across any domain. Communication is critical. Of course, it's a critical developmental milestone. I had a dear friend and colleague, Hank Bersani. He passed away a few years ago, but Hank and I would talk about if a child can only learn one word, is it better to teach that child no or yes? A no allows somebody to stop somebody from doing to them. Yes enables somebody to communicate what they like and what they desire. I think the truth is we need to enable young people to communicate both the no and the yes, even independent of their communication status. We need to work to ensure that communication isn't hindered by our what we're doing in terms of dependency creation, and that finally, we can provide supports in terms of communication supports that enable young people to more effectively communicate. There's a colleague in Germany is working on context-aware technology that we know a young person who may not speak verbally, if they're smiling, we can assume that they're happy about something, right? But it's often difficult to kind of, we're not paying attention 100% of the time, but this technology can help by reading people's facial and body movements and then convert that to speech so that people can begin to communicate simply by bodily expressions of their emotions. So there's a lot of ways in which these issues are going to be addressed. So,
yes, I agree that technology, because you refer to technology, is here to stay anyway, and we use it because in the past we had a kind of technophobia that the technology is going to replace the educators. But yes, technology is here to stay, and it can promote several skills, including self-determination, of course, of students, or it can facilitate, their learning, and of course improve the quality of their life. I have a last question, which is something about, because at some point you referred to the transition from school life to post-school adults life. And I have what Goodley said, I have this in front of me, that self-advocacy, Goodley said, implies the right of self-determination of individuals who are considered as having disability. This right is often not attributed to them as individuals, but as members of groups of fellows, of advocacy groups. So this right is yes, I read this. So this right recognizes the capacity of those groups of disabled people to be independent from service providers and professionals when it comes to decision making, but not the individuals with disability. So it is a right of the group, but not of the individuals. In my experience in Cyprus, for example, we may do some beautiful things during children's schooling in terms of self-determination. We are not doing a lot simply because the teachers are not well trained, but let's say that we are doing some beautiful things to promote that skill. But when after schooling, in adulthood, all of these beautiful things collapse. And of course, it depends where these individuals will end up. Some of them may see themselves isolated at home with someone else providing support and care. So that powerful person makes all decisions on their behalf. Um, what is your point of view? I mean, do people with severe disabilities obtain this victim status in adulthood? And their rights of self-advocacy, self-determination are recognized only as members of advocacy groups, but not as individuals.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I like the idea that self-advocacy is a personal expression of self-determination, because I think it is. And I think people who are effective self-advocates are people who are self-determined and doing that for the group, but also for their individual. But I do agree that particularly in adulthood, the systems that support people, and I don't think it's any different between Cyprus and the U.S. We're dealing with the same things. There hasn't been as much of a focus, I think, on self-determination and autonomy supports. I did a plenary for the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities a few years ago. I was asked to look back at where we were and where we are now. And frankly, in the U.S., my point was we're stuck in the 1980s. Group homes were best practice. Shelter workshops were best practice. Self-contained classrooms were best practice. We know how to do better. We know how to supported employment. We know how to enable people to live independent. We know how to teach young people in inclusive settings. But it's a matter, I think, of social and political will to actually do those things, because in practice we continue to emphasize these basically segregating environments. I think that as educators, we can work to change those systems, first of all. And I do know some people in adult systems that are working to change, and there are models, and I think that will continue. But I think the other thing is that young people who leave school as self-determined are going to be more likely to create environments and contexts that reflect what they want to be doing, what they're interested in doing. People with the most extensive support needs, who may have limited verbal communication, they can still communicate their unhappiness about being at the sheltered workshop, for example. And what it takes is people who are keyed in and understand what that means, what that person is communicating. Because obviously folks with the most extensive support needs will have limited agency to change things themselves. They need allies, they need advocates. And that's where, whether that's in a self-advocacy context or whether, one of the biggest crises here in the US is the lack of direct support workers in adult systems, and the lack of training that many of these people get. So we have systems that really are created and have visions and missions that are aligned with the CRPD and self-determination, all that. But then they're implemented by people who have little or no training, who are paid very little, and it's very difficult work circumstances. So that we need to really have systems where people who work, and particularly in direct support roles, they understand these issues of self-determination. They themselves, I think one of the things, and I think it's true for teachers as well, if we don't provide autonomy and self-determination opportunities to teachers, to direct support workers. They are not going to provide those opportunities for students. If teachers just are, have to do what they're told to do, have no autonomy, no voice about what they do, then they're not going to be very good at enabling young people with disabilities. So, I think we've got to emphasize and focus on the self-determination of teachers, of direct support workers in systems so that they have the autonomy that enable them to support the autonomy and self-determination of people with disabilities. It's a challenge, but I honestly think we know how to do it. It's a matter of leveraging that. And, I think one of the things I've learned in my career that around focus of self-determination beginning in the 1990s, it just takes time to change these things. I wish there were quick things. And I have no tolerance anymore for segregation. I think we in the US, we've tried to change things incrementally, a little bit at a time. And frankly, that has failed. Incrementalism has failed. People with disabilities were in nursing homes, in segregated settings during the COVID pandemic. They were highly susceptible because of those environments. We've got to drop this notion of incremental change, and we just need to create meaningful change, and we need to do it alongside people, disabled people, as colleagues, as peers, and as allies. So that's my soapbox.
Yeah. Thanks for answering. You inspired us with the way you're thinking, the way you answered the question. We know well how to to promote these skills, but the problem maybe is political, the decisions that, for example, politicians, as I said, in Cyprus, perpetuate this view of the charity approach to disability. So how can we convince those politicians who make decisions that we should change, the system to promote self, and we should hear them. We should take into account their voices, and the society actually creates these barriers, as we said. We need to change the society first. We are running out of time, by the way, so which means that I wish we had more time to discuss. We had a few more comments. People are sharing. The person actually who referred earlier to his to the translation of the your theory, your work actually, and in Greek. Tassos Asbestas is his name. He referred to the opportunity he had to work. We don't have more questions, as I can see. So
I'm looking at the comments, so I just want to say thank you to everyone for your kind remarks. I want to encourage all of you who are leaders, who are the next generation of inclusive practices and self-determination. You're the future, and it's always wonderful for me to meet and to hear from people who are doing great work, like your colleagues and yourself. And so I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I've had the great privilege of being the spokesperson for something that's critically important, and that is issues of self-determination. And so.
Yeah, well, I think that everyone here agrees that there are plenty of take-home messages that we keep from today's session. I think it's time to focus on what teachers can do, as you say, students can do, rather than what they can't do. In your talk, you explored central defining questions for the field of special and inclusive education. who, what, and where do we teach, what works in inclusive education. We keep, of course, the centrality of self-determination, and a key approach that should and will navigate, if you want, the future inclusive policies and practices. I would like to acknowledge all the audience, people who joined us today. I think everyone agrees that it was a very inspiring, comprehensive, very helpful presentation from our distinguished guest. Professor Wehmeyer, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your valuable contribution. It has been an honor to have met you and worked with you. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much.
As we said, you're welcome. As we said at the beginning of this session, the webinar has been recorded, so it will become available on the YouTube channel and Facebook page of the university. I'm sharing now. Hopefully, you can see the information about the webinar series and the website where you can find more information about the past and the forthcoming webinars. There is a sign-up form as well, so I encourage you to sign up to get reminders and notifications. Feel free to share this link with your colleagues who may be interested in watching the webinars. You can see the link here, www.unic.ac.cy/eduseries 2021-22. And here I'm sharing with you information about the 3 next forthcoming webinars with other distinguished world-leading researchers. We have one, the 7th webinar on the 13th of April with Professor Lynn Fuchs from Vanderbilt University and American Institutes for Research. The following day, 14th of April, we have the 8th webinar with Douglas Fuchs from the same university. And we have the 9th webinar on the 16th of May with Professor Kathleen Lynn Lane that you mentioned earlier from the University of Kansas. So that's all. Professor Wehmeyer, dear friends, thank you very much for watching this webinar and for your active participation. See you next time and have a good afternoon.